Poor girl gets ignored in modeling interview because of her outfit, until a millionaire reveals she'll be the new face of the campaign. The room was packed, cameras flashing like artificial thunder, and the young aspiring models lined up trembled with anticipation. Amidst expensive dresses and glittering heels, a girl entered wearing only a simple outfit, almost opaque compared to the luxury surrounding her. Muffled laughter arose in the corner of the room, followed by sidelong glances. "Did she wear that?" someone murmured, loud enough to hurt. The judges looked her up and down as if she were a mistake, a hindrance in this parade of vanity. The agency coordinator rolled her eyes and said coldly, "Next, please. This is no place for amateurs." The girl stood still, her heart racing, her face burning under the dozens of gazes. A cell phone camera recorded everything, immortalizing the scene of contempt. In that moment, she was just another anonymous person humiliated in public, erased by indifference. But something was about to happen. Just as the silence nearly swallowed her, a man's voice echoed firmly from the back of the room. Everyone turned, and the man in the impeccable suit, a magnetic presence, advanced with respect-commanding strides. He didn't look at the luxurious models or the haughty judges, only at the simple girl who remained standing, her eyes brimming with tears. With an enigmatic smile, he extended his hand and declared before everyone, "She will be the new face of the campaign." The shock was immediate. Laughter turned to astonishment. Whispers cut through the air like blades, and even the judges gasped. "Are you kidding?" someone said in disbelief. But the man didn't back down, and his gaze held something no one there understood. The girl, previously invisible, was now the center of all attention. Humiliated minutes ago, she became a symbol of something greater, and no one yet knew that this decision would change not only her life, but that of the millionaire himself. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. In the heart of Manhattan, a mirrored glass building reflected the gray morning sky. It was the day of the grand selection for the new fashion campaign that promised to reveal a new face to the world, and the atmosphere was electric. Models strutted down the hallways with rehearsed steps, their expensive clothes and impeccable makeup transforming the space into a makeshift runway. Journalists jostled for angles, cameras flashed in. Bursts, and the judges, seated behind an imposing table, observed every detail with stern gazes. Amidst this machinery of vanity and expectations, a young woman walked through the lobby, breathless. Her worn sneakers, simple blouse, and faded jeans made her stand out like a stain on a perfect canvas. The security guards looked her up and down, hesitant to let her pass, but she held up the temporary badge she'd obtained after begging at reception. The contrast between her appearance and that of the other attendees was stark, but the anxious gleam in her eyes seemed undaunted by the slanted glances. Around her, whispers arose, some chuckling quietly, others making cruel comments. The atmosphere was charged with arrogance and expectation, and in that setting dominated by luxury, her presence seemed a mistake. Yet each step she took echoed with silent resistance. At the back of the room, a man watched the scene without revealing his expression, simply watching with unusual interest this figure who dared to exist outside the norm everyone there desperately tried to emulate. From a young age, she had learned that silence was a form of survival. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts, where the cracked streets reflected more abandonment than hope, and each night was lulled by the distant sound of sirens and arguments piercing the thin wooden walls of the house where she lived. Her father had left early, leaving no trace other than debts and an absence that her mother tried to disguise with long workdays. The girl grew up learning to sew used clothes so they looked new, to share a piece of bread with her younger sister, and to smile even when her stomach growled. Every birthday, Gifts were improvised, sometimes an old book found in the trash, other times a scrap of fabric turned into a doll. But in her eyes was a light that never faded, a stubbornness that made her believe that life held more than scarcity. At school, it wasn't uncommon for her classmates to ridicule her for her simple clothes or the lack of snacks. She hung her head, but within herself she nurtured a silent promise. One day everyone would see she was worth more than appearances. When her mother fell ill and the situation worsened, the girl soon discovered the weight of responsibility. She began working odd jobs, cleaning houses, delivering newspapers, babysitting neighborhood children. The little she earned was enough to cover the minimum bills and buy her mother's necessary medicine. Every penny was counted as if it were gold, and each night she went to bed exhausted, but with a mind full of dreams no one could steal. It was during this period that she discovered her fascination with fashion, not because of the expensive window displays she could never afford, but because of the ability to transform what was discarded into something new. She took ripped dresses, sewed them, mended them, reinvented them. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the poor girl in old clothes, but a woman who carried in her hands the ability to reinvent herself. She saved magazine clippings found in the trash, observed every pose, every look of famous models, and practiced alone in front of the cracked reflection in the closet. With each gesture, she felt closer to a world that seemed unreachable, but which she believed she could touch. There were nights when she cried silently, drowning out the sound so as not to worry her mother. Loneliness was a constant burden, but at the same time a flame that drove her. The pain of being invisible, of being treated like a mistake, became fuel. When she turned 18, her mother was no longer there to see her go. With a small suitcase, packed more with souvenirs than clothes and a heart full of courage, she set off for the big city. She had only a few dollars, a persistent dream, and the certainty that she would not allow the world to crush her. In that luxurious hall, surrounded by people who looked at her with contempt, she carried not only the simplicity of her clothing, but the entire history of struggle and silence that shaped her strength. Behind her teary eyes lay much more than fragility. There was an old promise made to herself, never again to shrink before anyone. The room was filled with whispers and calculated glances. As the young models showed off their expensive dresses and perfectly coiffed hair, two judges exchanged comments in low voices, loud enough to echo like sharp knives in the protagonist's heart. One of them, with a wry smile, leaned toward the coordinator and said, "I bet you $50 she can't even get past the first question." The other laughed loudly, drawing the attention of those nearby, and added, "50? I say 100. $100 that she faints before she reaches the end of the runway. Look at her. She looks like she stepped straight out of a neighborhood supermarket, not an international casting call." Laughter spread, discreet but increasingly bold, as if the young woman were a living joke before everyone. The coordinator, vain and cruel, took advantage of the situation to intensify her humiliation. With an expression of false compassion, she approached and said theatrically, "Honey, you applied to the wrong place. This isn't a charity contest." The words sounded like a public blow, drawing nervous laughter from the audience watching the selection process. The girl felt her heart race, her face burn, and for a moment she considered running away, disappearing, to spare herself from this cruel spectacle. But her legs remained firm, as if her roots kept her rooted to the ground. The judges, fueled by their collective derision, decided to take the scene even further. One of them picked up a sheet of technical questions common in the selection process and said mockingly, "Let's see. Do you know the difference between haute couture and ready-to-wear? Or do you think it's the name of a cheap perfume?" Another wave of laughter erupted, this time without any shame. Cell phones were raised, recording the scene as if it were cheap entertainment. Each mocking smile seemed to erase what little dignity she still retained. At the back of the room, the millionaire watched everything silently, without interfering, like someone awaiting the outcome of a show whose ending he already knew. His eyes weren't focused on the collective laughter, but on the girl's reaction. And what he saw wasn't weakness, it was resilience. Even with her voice cracking, she lifted her chin, took a deep breath and answered the question calmly, displaying a knowledge no one expected. The laughter ceased for a brief moment, replaced by looks of surprise, but soon the judges resumed their cruel game, inventing even more difficult questions, creating obstacles just to see her stumble. It was clear this wasn't just a test, but a bet, a spectacle of humiliation disguised as a selection process. With each answer, even a correct one, the coordinator found a way to belittle her. "You can memorize terms, but you'll never have stage presence," he said with calculated disdain. The young woman swallowed the tears that threatened to well up and stood her ground, even though her heart was breaking inside. The entire room seemed to conspire against her, transforming the moment into a tribunal of contempt. And yet, it was precisely in that suffocating atmosphere that fate was about to take an irreversible turn, as if each cruel look were merely preparation for a twist everyone would never forget. The room was abuzz with chatter and muffled laughter as the unexpected silence descended. The sound of the millionaire's firm footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each beat resounding like an announcement of something inevitable. He walked through the crowd unhurriedly, but with the authority of someone who knew no one would dare stop him. He wore an impeccable dark suit, his tie neat, his shoes reflecting the white light of the spotlights. But it wasn't his appearance that captured attention, it was the intensity of his gaze. While everyone bowed and whispered to him, he never took his eyes off the girl standing in the center, small in the face of the room's grandeur, yet strangely towering over them all for her silent resistance. As he approached, he stopped a few feet away. The air seemed thicker, as if even the breath of those present had been held back. The judges, previously so haughty, swallowed hard. The coordinator forced a tight smile, trying to hide her insecurity, but he ignored them. He looked only at the girl, who was still struggling to stand upright, her heart hammering in her chest. Her teary eyes reflected pain, but also courage. For the first time, someone was looking at her not as a mistake, but as a revelation. He broke the silence with a firm, deep voice that carried like a contained thunderclap. "What's your name?" The simple, almost banal question sounded like her challenge, as if it were the first time anyone had recognized her in that setting. It took her a moment to answer, her throat dry, but when she spoke, her voice came out clear, if shaky. She said his name with all the dignity she still retained. The millionaire repeated it softly, as if memorizing something important, and smiled discreetly. The coordinator stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Sir, this candidate doesn't fit the profile we're looking for. She's just a—" Before she could finish, he raised his hand in a subtle yet relentless gesture, and the silence forced her to silence. He turned back to the girl and, with a sharp look, asked, "Why are you here? What made you come into this room, even though you knew everyone would look at you that way?" The room held its breath. It was the question no one would ask because no one cared, but he wanted to hear it. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Her hands were sweating. Her knees were nearly buckling, but her soul cried out for a voice. "Because I know my worth," he replied. A whisper ran through the audience, a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. "I know I don't have the right clothes or the right shoes, but I know I can represent so much more than just appearance. I'm here because I never want to be invisible again." Raw sincerity pierced the air like an invisible blade. The millionaire watched her in silence for a few eternal seconds, and then, to everyone's shock, he extended his hand. The gesture seemed simple, but in context it was revolutionary. "So let's show them who you really are," he said without hesitation. The girl looked at that strong, elegant hand, and for a moment doubted its realness. When she finally took it, she felt as if an electric current coursed through her, not from fear, but from a destiny that was beginning to unfold before her. The crowd murmured in shock, the judges looking at each other in concealed despair. The millionaire didn't look at anyone else. He simply led her a few steps forward, positioning her in the center of the room. The flashes went off, not at the photographer's behest, but because everyone knew they were witnessing something that would change the course of the selection process. And in that instant, their first contact wasn't just a meeting of eyes, but the beginning of a story that would traverse vanity and expose secrets neither of them could have imagined. The room, still gripped by the tension of the unexpected, couldn't bear the reversal of logic the millionaire imposed. The initial silence was soon broken by a chorus of whispers and venomous looks. The other models, who had previously displayed confident smiles, now frowned in disdain, as if the mere presence of that simple girl next to the most powerful man in the room were a personal affront. One of them, in a silver dress, couldn't contain her arrogance. "This has to be a marketing joke. No one in their right mind would take this thing seriously." Laughter spread like sparks of fire on dry straw, and soon the young woman was once again enveloped in a wave of collective contempt. The coordinator, upset at having been silenced minutes earlier, decided to regain control through cruelty. She approached theatrically with her posture erect and a calculated gaze, and declared loudly for all to hear, "Sir, with all due respect, this girl does not represent our brand. She has no bearing, no magazine cover face. She's just another lost dreamer, someone who should never have entered this environment." The words, sharp as razors, echoed in the room. Many nodded, others recorded with their cell phones, eager to turn this spectacle into gossip fodder. The millionaire kept his expression firm but didn't intervene. He wanted to see how far they would go, and the young woman, feeling exposed, realized it was now her against the world. She took a deep breath, but before she could react, one of the judges stood up with a piece of paper in his hand and said, "If she's as special as you say, let's really test her." He placed a pair of expensive high heels in front of her and ordered, "Show us your runway." The room exploded in anticipation. The pair of shoes, shiny and imposing, seemed more of a cruel challenge than an opportunity. The young woman looked down at the worn sneakers on her feet and felt her heart sink. Reluctantly, she slipped on her shoes, which were too big for her, and walked onto the makeshift catwalk. Her first steps were uncertain, almost stumbling, and the laughter echoed like an audience thirsting for a spectacle. "See, she can't even walk," someone mocked. "She's a complete disaster," another added. The humiliation grew in waves, each laugh louder, each comment crueler. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor seemed to match the rhythm of the collective judgment. She breathed deeply, trying not to give in, but the pressure was unbearable. Halfway through the walk, one of the judges, in a loud and sarcastically voice, shouted, "This isn't a supermarket runway, dear. This is high fashion." Thunderous laughter filled the room, and the young woman felt a tear escape, betraying her resolve. One of the cell phone cameras captured the moment, and the image of the failed candidate was ready to go viral. Even so, she reached the end of the runway, turned with what dignity she had left, and faced the crowd. The room was ecstatic at her symbolic fall, as if they had won an invisible battle. The coordinator, triumphant, raised her eyebrows and said coldly, "This proves that dreams don't buy talent." And there, in front of everyone, the humiliation was crowned with mocking applause, a scene calculated to crush any spark of courage. But what no one noticed was that, behind that haggard face, the girl's flame was not extinguished. On the contrary, it was beginning to glow with a brilliance none of them could control. The room was still buzzing with laughter, mocking applause, and venomous looks when the girl, instead of giving in to shame, took a deep breath and let the silence descend. It wasn't a silence of defeat, but of preparation. She lifted her face, discreetly wiped away the tear that betrayed her pain, and with a calm that seemed impossible in that hostile environment, gave a soft, almost defiant smile. The gesture disconcerted some of the audience, who expected to see her run away. Then, in a firm voice, she said, "Funny. Everyone seems to think I'm here by mistake, but I knew exactly what I'd find." The coordinator raised her eyebrows, surprised by her boldness, and tried to cut her off. "You have no idea what you're talking about, dear." But the young woman didn't back down. She continued even more firmly, "I knew I would be judged by my clothes, my shoes, my simple hairstyle. I knew they would laugh at me, treat me as if I were invisible, or as if I had invaded a place where I don't belong. But I walked through that door anyway because I didn't come seeking your approval. I came to prove to myself that no one here has the power to define me." The words, raw and sharp, carried through the room as if they carried physical weight. The whispers gradually died down. Some previously arrogant looks now revealed discomfort. One of the jurors tried to laugh, but it sounded forced and out of place. The girl, sensing she had captured everyone's attention, took another step forward and added, "You forgot the cameras are on, that every gesture and every word spoken here travels beyond these walls. You thought you would humiliate me in silence, but all of this is already being recorded." She discreetly pointed to the cell phones held aloft, capturing every moment like unwitting witnesses. The millionaire, until then quiet, watched with a curious gleam in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. He didn't need to intervene. The young woman was, on her own, dismantling the logic of power everyone there maintained. "You bet against me," she said, looking directly at the jurors who had laughed at her answers. "But know that I bet too. I bet that I would have the courage to go all the way, even when everyone tried to bring me down. And that bet, no one can take away from me." The room fell into an uncomfortable, heavy silence. For the first time, the humiliation seemed to have shifted. The coordinator tried to hide her nervousness with an ironic smile, but her eyes betrayed insecurity. The models, who had previously been laughing, now looked at each other uneasy. The young woman took a deep breath and concluded, "I knew everything, and yet I chose to be here, not for you but for myself, and that's more than enough." Those words, spoken firmly, weren't just a defense. They were a silent, poetic counterattack, transforming the scene of humiliation into an act of revelation. Who, seconds before, had seemed a helpless victim, now stood tall as someone carrying an invisible force, impossible to ignore. That night, after the salon doors closed and the murmur of voices faded from the Manhattan streets, the millionaire remained restless. There was something about that girl that wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't just her boldness in facing everyone in public, or the strength hidden behind her tired eyes, but a strange sense of familiarity, as if he'd seen her before somewhere he couldn't quite remember. Back in his office, a spacious space lit only by the soft city light. Reflected in the windows, he asked an assistant to discreetly research the unlikely candidate. The minutes dragged by until a folder was delivered to his desk. Upon opening it, the millionaire found more than he bargained for. Her name, simple and unremarkable, hid a story marked by pain and resilience. Yellowed photographs revealed a difficult childhood in poor neighborhoods he himself knew, neighborhoods where his empire had grown through land purchases and businesses that, in the past, swallowed up small homes belonging to desperate families. Among the newspaper clippings, one detail made him catch his breath. There was a report of a sick woman, the young woman's mother, who had lost everything after his company acquired, for nothing, the property where they lived. At that moment, the memory hit him like an invisible punch. He remembered signing a contract years before for an expropriation considered a good deal, but which now had a face, tears, and consequences. The young woman who had been the target of ridicule in that room was the daughter of one of the many families his ambition had crushed without hesitation. Suddenly, every word she spoke that afternoon took on new weight. "I knew everything," echoed in her mind like a riddle revealed. She had not only endured conscious humiliation, but she also carried knowledge no one there imagined. She knew who he was and what his fortune had cost. The millionaire closed his eyes, resting his forehead against his hands. For the first time in a long time, the feeling of absolute control over his life and business seemed to have dissolved. The image of the girl lifting her chin, her eyes teary but firm, haunted him. She wasn't just an unlikely candidate. She was the vivid reminder of a guilt he'd never admitted to feeling. As he tried to reason, a question lingered in his mind. Had she entered that hall merely out of a dream, or out of silent revenge? The possibility disturbed him, not because of the direct threat, but because he knew that if it were true that young woman had already won without needing applause, her power lay precisely in demanding nothing, in simply existing like the scar he was trying to hide. Outside, the city was still noisy, but inside the office, the silence was overwhelming. The millionaire finally understood that the girl he'd chosen before everyone else wasn't a bold bet or a whim of chance. It was an inevitable encounter with the past he'd believed he'd buried. In the days following the salon scandal, the girl became a topic of conversation, not only among the judges and models, but also on social media. The video of her steadfastness in the face of laughter spread quickly, garnering thousands of views within hours. The scene in which she said, "I knew everything," was shared in different versions. Some praised her as an example of courage, others ridiculed her as the poor girl who thought she was a model. But among all these outside eyes, there was one in particular that she could no longer divert from, that of the millionaire. Accustomed to seeing faces and names pass like smoke in his business world, he now found himself revisiting the video countless times, pausing over the details, the gestures, the seconds when her eyes shone with tears and determination. The more he watched, the more he felt something inside him stirring, something he had never before allowed to exist. It wasn't just curiosity, it was absence. As if suddenly there was a void in his routine without her presence. He tried to find her. He sent messages through the agency, discreetly asked for information, but discovered that she hadn't returned for any of the next steps. She didn't answer phone calls, didn't respond to invitations. She simply disappeared, as if she'd fulfilled her desired role on that stage and quietly withdrawn. This left him disturbed. For the first time, someone wasn't rushing toward him at the slightest sign, wasn't clinging to the power his name represented. Instead, she seemed to have vanished by choice, leaving him trapped in the echo of his own memories. At each meeting, amid contracts and figures, his mind returned to the same point. Her eyes as she held his hand, her firm voice that disarmed the entire room, the revelation that she knew everything. Who disappears like that, after being thrust into the world's spotlight? Who has the courage to turn their back on what so many others would kill to win? The answer bothered him. Even more, someone who didn't need him. One afternoon, walking alone through the lobby of one of his buildings, he saw a girl in simple clothes hurry past, and, for a moment, he believed it was her. His heart raced, but as he approached, he realized he had been mistaken. The frustration was immediate, as if he had lost something he had never truly had. That night, sitting before the immensity of his penthouse, with the lights of New York twinkling like artificial constellations, he silently wondered why he missed someone he had known so little. But the answer was there, evident. It wasn't the lack of companionship, it was the lack of what she represented. In her disappearance, he encountered the most uncomfortable reflection of himself. He discovered that all his power, his impeccable clothes, his million-dollar contracts were worthless to someone who chose not to be there. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. And paradoxically, it was in her absence that he began to realize that something inside him was also missing, something that perhaps could only be recovered by finding her again. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling narratives and manipulating public perceptions, didn't expect that the choice of that simple young woman would become an uncomfortable reflection of himself. At first, the viral video placed her at the center of attention, but quickly, eyes began to turn to him. Comments multiplied on social media. Some accused him of using the girl as a marketing ploy, others of mocking her in a cruel game disguised as generosity. Online newspapers ran provocative headlines: "Philanthropist or manipulator? Millionaire turns humiliation into a spectacle. Who really wins from the power play?" At social events, whispers rippled through the halls when he entered. Former business allies, always ready to praise him, now avoided direct contact, fearing they would be associated with a tarnished image. His company, built on the prestige of exclusivity and luxury, began to face harsh criticism. Consumers, once fascinated by the brand's brilliance, wondered if the empire was merely a polished showcase sustained by cynicism. The episode that should have been forgotten as just another casting became a symbol of collective arrogance, and his figure emerged as the narrative's main villain. In impromptu interviews, journalists confronted him with sharp questions. Did you really believe in her talent, or was it just a show of power? What connection does your name have with the history of her family, who lost everything in a land expropriation process? Do you regret it, or do you stand by your decision? Every answer was analyzed, distorted, and echoed, and no matter how hard he tried to control the damage, nothing seemed enough. His image, which had always been synonymous with respect and authority, was beginning to crack in public. The hardest blow came when old documents about his business dealings were resurfaced. Headlines recalled that many of his properties had been built on the pain of poor families evicted from their homes. It was as if the young woman's appearance had lit a torch on long-buried secrets. He, who had always prided himself on being called a visionary, was now described as a predator of opportunity. The downfall wasn't financial, not yet, but symbolic, social, and this, for someone like him, hurt much more. Alone in his penthouse, surveying the city that once seemed to belong to him, he realized that the stares were no longer of admiration, but of judgment. The public, which had previously knelt before his fortune, now held him up as an example of the moral decay of power. And in every headline, in every comment, her name appeared as a contrast. The simple girl who stood firm in the face of laughter was now the symbol of resistance. He, the reflection of exposed arrogance. It was the beginning of a public downfall he never imagined he would face, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, deep down he knew she was the reason for it all. His public downfall hit him in a way no amount of money could prevent. It wasn't the first time he'd faced criticism, but he'd never felt the pressure of public opinion so personally. Before, problems were resolved with lawyers, official statements, and silent figures that bought silence. Now, nothing seemed enough. With each interview, with each viral post, his image was deconstructed, and in the media's mirror, he no longer saw the respected businessman, but a man surrounded by the shadows of past choices. The millionaire began to isolate himself. The lavish dinners lost their appeal, the business meetings became cold, and the constant company of sycophants no longer brought him comfort. He found himself alone, surrounded by glass walls that reflected only his own image. And in this solitude, memories began to haunt him. He saw the face of the young woman's mother, imprinted on the documents that reminded him of the expropriation. He saw the girl's eyes, firm and resilient, staring at him in the living room. And above all, he heard her own words echoing in his mind. "I knew everything." For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something he had always rejected: guilt. A deep, slowly gnawing guilt, revealing that his fortune was not only the result of vision and hard work, but also of decisions that crushed the dreams of others. Sleepless nights became frequent. He would get up, walk silently, around the rooftop, gaze out at the illuminated city, and wonder how many invisible people like her had been erased by his ambition. The transformation wasn't immediate, but began with small gestures. He cut ties with business partners who shared his cruelty. He cancelled projects that would have destroyed entire communities. He began visiting, anonymously, places where inequality was glaring. He wasn't a messiah, he wasn't a hero, he was simply a man trying for the first time to look beyond his own reflection. And in the midst of this process, her absence grew like an open wound. It wasn't just attraction or fascination, but the knowledge that by disappearing, she had taken with her the only chance at redemption he'd ever seen. It was as if the young woman was the connecting thread between the man he had been and the man he could be. Every transformation he attempted felt incomplete without her presence. The millionaire, who had always believed he could buy anything, finally understood what couldn't be bought: forgiveness, dignity, genuine presence. And that was exactly what he began to seek, not as a whim, but as a vital necessity. In his silent metamorphosis, it was no longer about saving his public image, but about saving himself from an emptiness that for the first time frightened him. The city continued to pulsate with its lights and vanity, but within him something was emerging in contrast, a sincere desire to shed his masks. And, behind it all, the uncontainable desire to find her again, not to prove his power, but to ask for something he'd never asked of anyone, a chance to be seen as a man, not a millionaire. Their reunion didn't take place in a spotlight-filled hall, nor surrounded by camera flashes and anxious journalists. It was by chance in a small, quiet space, far removed from the glitter that had always accompanied the millionaire. He saw her first, She was sitting in a modest Brooklyn coffee shop, dressed with the same simplicity that had so disturbed the judges weeks before. Before her, an open notebook filled with clothing designs, improvised sketches in pencil and blue pen, showed that, despite the public humiliation, the dream hadn't died. For a moment, he hesitated. The man who had once signed million-dollar contracts without blinking now felt incapable of taking a single step toward her. His heart raced, and the strange feeling of vulnerability crept back into his chest. But finally, he stepped forward. As his shadow fell across the table, she looked up and met his gaze. The silence that followed was charged, full of unspoken meaning. There was no surprise in his gaze. It was as if she had already expected that, sooner or later, he would find her. "You disappeared," he said, his voice low, almost a plea. She closed the notebook slowly, as if guarding not only drawings, but also still open wounds. "I was never really here for you," she replied firmly, without anger, but with a clarity that disarmed him. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his eyes searching for some trace of softness that might give him space to continue. But there was no easy space. She was calm, but it wasn't the calm of indifference. It was the calm of someone who carries their dignity intact. "I discovered things about you, about your family, about your mother," he confessed, with a weight that seemed difficult to bear. Her face remained impassive, but her eyes shone for a moment, revealing that the wound was still raw. "And what does that change?" he asked. "Nothing can bring my mother back. Nothing can give back the years we lost." He took a deep breath, feeling smaller and smaller in front of her. "I know, but I've changed. You made me see who I was, what I destroyed to get here. I'm not asking you to forget. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be different." She looked away for a moment, staring at the window of the cafe where life went on, indifferent to that conversation, laden with memories and fates. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with unanswered questions. When she looked back at him, her eyes held no hatred, but neither did they offer easy forgiveness. "I didn't come here to be your redemption. I didn't come here to heal your guilt. What you do with your life is your choice, not my responsibility." The words hurt him at first, but he soon realized they were true. Their reunion wasn't a gift to him. It was just another choice she made, and the fact that she was there sitting before him was already more than he could ask for. He nodded, silently accepting what he would never have accepted before. In that small cafe, without an audience, without cameras, without luxury, the two finally met as they truly were. He, a broken man trying to rebuild himself, she, a woman scarred by pain but standing tall, her dreams still alive on the paper before her. And somehow, in that moment, they both knew the story wasn't over. Silence hung between them like a taut rope, ready to snap at any moment. The millionaire, accustomed to dictating destinies with a simple signature, now waited, vulnerable, for the verdict of a young woman who stared at him, not with hatred, but with the serenity of someone who has learned to bear scars. She took a deep breath, her fingers sliding along the edges of the notebook where she sketched clothes, graphite dreams that had survived every no she had ever heard. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "You put me in the center of a scene I already knew would be cruel. I walked into that room prepared to be ridiculed. But what you might not understand is that I wasn't just fighting for a place in fashion. I was fighting against the weight of years of pain that your company helped place on my shoulders." He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on her, defenseless. "And now you come along saying you've changed, that you're trying to be different. But I need to decide if that's enough for me." She looked out of the cafe, watching the people hurrying by, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the small wooden table. "I could simply turn my back and move on. I have the strength to do so. But part of me still believes that if even someone like you can change, then perhaps the world isn't so lost." She turned back to him, her gaze steady, incisive. "But change isn't proven in words spoken in an afternoon. Change is proven in silence, in actions no one sees, in choices you make when you're not being observed." He tried to say something, but she gently raised her hand, begging him not to interrupt. "I won't be the woman who carries your redemption. That's not my role. Forgiveness isn't a gift I owe you. It's perhaps a path you must earn on your own. So listen carefully, I'm not giving you an answer today." The words fell like a sentence, but not a sentence of condemnation, of freedom. She stood, grabbed the notebook, and put it in her bag. Before leaving, she bowed slightly, her voice low but sharp. "Maybe one day I'll look at you again without seeing the man who destroyed my family. Maybe one day. But until then, my life won't stop waiting for you to change." And with firm steps, she left the coffee shop, the sound of the door closing behind her like a suspended period, not sealing the ending but leaving the story open. He remained seated, motionless, feeling not absolute rejection, but something even more painful, the need to earn, day after day, the chance that she might one day choose to stay. That night a light rain fell over New York, washing the streets lit by tired neon signs. The millionaire walked alone, without bodyguards, without luxury cars, just a man with his hands in his coat pockets, lost in his own thoughts. He stopped in front of a closed store window, where a mannequin wore a simple white dress. He stood there, staring at his own reflection mingled with the mannequin's. Behind the glass, the fabric seemed to pulse like a memory, reminding him of the gaze of the young woman who had stood before them all with dignity. Across the city she drew in silence, sitting at her small table illuminated only by the yellow glow of an old lamp. Each line on the paper was made calmly, as if stitching together pieces of the future. Beside her, a scrap of worn fabric was becoming the sketch of a makeshift dress. She paused for a moment, stared at the sketchbook, and smiled, not for it, but for herself, as if finally recognizing her own worth. As the rain intensified, he took his cell phone from his pocket, opened the camera and instead of photographing the shop window, pointed it at his own reflection. He remained silent for a few seconds, then put the device away, as if he'd realized he didn't need to record anything, just live. At that same moment, in her cramped room, she turned off the light, closed her notebook, and rested her head on the pillow, her eyes wide open in the darkness, imagining the future that was yet to come. Neither of them said a word, but somehow in silence and from a distance, they were connected by the memory of that room of humiliation that had become a stage of revelation. The city lived on, indifferent, but amidst the millions of lights flickering on and off, there were two souls who, without promises, now carried a common scar and perhaps a possibility. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.